Hey everyone, I'm Susan.
I'm Matt.
And here we are in neighbouring rights land. I'll just do a quick intro for myself. I work at White Sky Music. We're a business management firm covering all sorts of the sort of business money end of music. So, from tax to touring help, reporting, analytics. It is totally sexy. I was saying earlier, we get people out of bed at 10 o'clock in the morning at Big Sound. That's what I'm saying. And I work specifically in this kind of royalties and reporting and analytics data sort of thing. So that's my little piece of the world, Susan.
I really love how sexy that sounds. I mean,
I'm
just like, because, I get what you're saying. I am Susan. Neighbouring rights is my world. I'm not as boring as that might sound. If anybody has seen our website, the Good Neighbour website, the first thing it says is, neighbouring rights is boring, $2.7 billion US dollars worth of boring. So I'm not sure how boring that is. It's actually a really fascinating area of the industry and one I am utterly, utterly passionate about and something I have been doing for, a couple of decades, 25 years.
Don't give anything away.
In neighbouring rights.
Don't give anything away.
Yeah, so just in neighbouring rights, about 25 years, which is pretty crazy because Australia's still getting their head across it. Just a bit of right place, right time, or some might say the opposite to that.
Perhaps
wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. You make your niche for yourself, isn't it? It's like, hey, I'm going to grow up to be this guy who crunches numbers about music that no one really knows or cares much about.
Yeah.
We try. So I guess wanted to start off with just a bit of a quick brief. I'm not sure of the sort of experience and knowledge in the room, so we won't harp on the sort of early things too much, but just wanted, I guess, to clarify where we're sort of coming from. So the first little slide thing that we've got up here is basically a sort of simplified view of kind of how royalties and money moves throughout the Australian music industry, specifically Australian, when it comes to the names up there. Don't worry about the fine print. That's not meant to be read. It's part of a bigger presentation where it zooms in. This is just the overview. So at right back to basics, there's publishing side of the world, which we put at the top here. So the song itself, the songwriting, the musical work, and then there's the sound recording side of copyright. So we've got all the things to do with sound recordings down below that centre line. In the centre, there's your forms of exploitation, which generate royalties that sort of can either go above the line and or below the line. Today, we don't want to hear anything about APRA and AMCOS. Nothing to do with this.
If you mention AMCOS especially, you have to leave immediately.
Susan disappears like that. Our kind of world is down here in Australia. PPCA are the kind of people that dwell in this kind of area. So that's our little corner of the world that we're speaking about today. And not getting into all of this stuff, but just wanted to sort of, I guess, give a broader overview of how it kind of looks in a simplistic way. And just to mention that forget those guys up there, we're all about down here, and specifically this bottom right corner. And the next slide, I believe, shows a little bit more detail about that.
I think,
to do with neighbouring rights specifically.
It's the little basic Good Neighbour 101. If you want to put that on, that would be great. Just slide 2. Look at that.
Boom.
It's very basic, and that's our intention, because we are talking about master recordings again. As Matt said, we're talking about that side of the universe that I call the music universe. It's the master recording side, the dark side, because we're talking about record labels.
Boom.
But also musicians. So we can do that. So as you can see, Good Neighbour performers, we do actually represent some rights holders. More on that later. But essentially, that's what we do. Rights holders, 50% of the money goes to rights holders, 50% to the performers. And essentially what we're saying is that every time a sound recording gets played on radio, let's say $100 is generated, $50 goes to the rights holder, $50 goes to the performers. Simple. You can all go home now. That's neighbouring rights.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, but it's all based on the sound recording side. And I just met a lovely lawyer from Media Arts Lawyers just before, and they said that they did a sound production course. And I think that's a great place to start when you've done a sound production course, because it starts to get you thinking about that master rights side. Because most people that come and talk to me, they obviously speak to us about publishing, and a lot of people know lots about publishing, but they don't know a lot about the rights holder side.
And I think just the last, again, this isn't a whole slideshow thing, just a bit of background, but the next, the sort of last one, which I guess we'll leave up, very similar to the first one that was more a simplistic view of Australia. This one sort of gets a bit more into the world, I guess, Susan. That's how you'd say it.
I feel like I need my pointer, don't I?
Laser thing.
I always wanted to be a weather girl. Yeah, it is. So the reason I put this up is because the music universe, basically I carved my understanding of neighbouring rights from this poster that was sat in my office in London, which I used to ignore all the time until I realised I actually had to learn about what the hell this company did that I was working for. So I was in London as a singer-songwriter, trying to get a record deal, playing all the worst gigs, and felt really bad because I couldn't pay my musicians, so I worked during the day so I could pay my musos. And then I got this gig, and it told me that this place I worked paid musicians, and I was like, what the hell? How does that work? And so, again, this is the music universe on the songwriter side, which we are not talking about, and this is where we start. And I like that the artist is front and center here, and then the record company is secondary. And then all these offshoots of it. PPL here is the equivalent to PPCA in Australia. And the organisation I worked for, Performing Artists Media Rights Association, PAMRA, which doesn't exist anymore, it was absorbed by PPL. That's where I used to work in the UK. So it's where it all began. Pretty
pictures. So we're getting into all that stuff. I guess, Susan, we were talking earlier, I mentioned there was an earlier thing about Australia. We're talking about PPL here. And one of the things that I think gets sort of down the rabbit hole with neighbouring rights is that, it's just not the same everywhere. It's just, you can't just sort of like, I'll sign up with someone and then you're covered. Because there's a lot of differences in countries and territories and rules. Can you fill us in a little bit, Susan, on maybe some of the differences across the industry in this space?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that we should first take a bit of a deep dive into is the different types of legislation. So some of you might have heard about the Rome Convention, which is really sexy. It's to do with technology changing, and obviously once they were able to make sound recordings and reproduce sound recordings, they were able to do that much earlier with print music and composers and stuff. So that's why we had the Berne Convention in the 1880s. But the Rome Convention was something that came about in the 1960s, which was to do with the protection of sound recordings. So it all stems from there. This is at the root of that, and whether a country has signed on to the Rome Convention or not would determine whether a sound recording qualifies. The other piece of legislation that's important is called the WPPT, which is to do with the WIPO phonograms. There's that word again, phonogram performers treaty. So the WPPT basically just talks about how record companies and performers are remunerated, essentially. So it's another important piece of legislation. So in terms of, to answer your question, how things kind of change move between the different countries, let's just go with things in a nutshell. They're kind of like gobsmacked kind of response that we often get. So obviously the US is not a signatory to the Rome Convention, so their sound recordings are not protected. So anytime terrestrial radio, which is traditional radio, plays a sound recording in the US, there is no payment to the record company.
And they're kind of in the minority, right?
They are in the minority,
A lot of people signed that Rome Convention, and a couple didn't. The US is a big one.
The US is a big one, yes. Australia is a signatory, so you'll be happy to know. So that's all cool. But this is when we start to get into the weeds a bit. And forgive me, because I know there are some burning questions about LODs and sound exchange and stuff. So whilst we're talking about the US, and we're going to refer it and bring it back to Australia, whilst we're talking about the US, it's important to know that whilst I've said that sound recordings are not protected, there is another piece of legislation that came about in 2005, which was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And the DMCA was there to protect basically recordings that are on digital radio, played on digital radio, Sirius XM and so forth. So those, and for anybody here probably have heard of Sound Exchange, that's what Sound Exchange pays and collects.
That's right, because the terrestrial radio lobby, probably quite powerful people, and just kind of like, no, we're not paying anymore. We're not paying those royalties. We do the A-word APRA ones, but we're not doing those ones. But with the DMCA, they got digital.
It should be a band name. I like that.
What's that one?
DMCA. I guess we got the DMA, so can't really
that's too close.
Yeah. So I just a couple of things. I want to summarise 3 things here, which aren't going to make much sense to you. But if you've worked in neighbouring rights, I can see we've got a few of our good neighbour people here. It will make more sense if I put it in some more kind of in the real world of neighbouring rights language. But for now, to summarise, what we're talking about here is qualification. So we're talking about qualification of sound recordings, and I've just said to you a sound recording qualifies because the country is a signatory to the Rome Convention or doesn't qualify as a result of that. Then there's the WPPT. So based on those kinds of things that I'd like to summarise here, we're talking about how something qualifies, whether it's the performer or the sound recording. And that could be based on Rome Convention country or WPPT. It could be based on this concept known as material reciprocity, or just reciprocity is what we call, versus national treatment. And we will talk about those 2 things which are really important. And it can also be based on one other thing called first publication. In the real world of when you're working in neighbouring rights, we have a band of different ways a performer can qualify. So it would be country of recording, commissioning territory, citizenship or residency at the time of recording. So we base it on these kind of 4 components, which will enable us to learn and understand whether a performer qualifies for this money. But I don't want to get too much into that. So just let me cover off on these points here.
So the reciprocity thing
Yep.
Is kind of an interesting thing, because that's kind of like, if you do it, I'll do it. If you don't do it, I'm not doing
Fairness.
it. Yeah,
Correct.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm not sure if it's a good time to talk about 2013 when it comes to reciprocity, do you think?
Yeah, I guess, again, that's one of those jaw-dropping kind of points. So in the UK, let's talk about the UK, our friends in the UK. In the UK always used to pay Australians. So I started in the UK in 1999, and they paid Australian performers. So my job was I'd look up In Excess and go, ooh, there's some good money there for In Excess. Oh, there's some, and I said to you, Matt, on my way here, I got a call from one of the performers that I first worked with in Neighbouring Rights, which was a track that had gone #1 in the UK in 1999, which was by a Melbourne duo called Madison Avenue with Don't Call Me Baby. And they're still our clients today. So we were able to pay them money for being contributors to a sound recording. In 2013, the UK decided to turn that tap off. And the very basic reason for that is because they no longer pay us because we don't pay them. And that what is essentially, of course, what reciprocity means. So if we start talking about reciprocity, I guess because there's so many different avenues for us to start to go into here, and I also don't want to lose the point on performers' copyright that we spoke about before.
Yeah,
so we'll come back to that. But let's just talk about the UK. So let's talk about sound recordings. So in the UK, Australian sound recordings qualify. And can someone tell me why Australian sound recordings qualify in the UK? Come on, lawyers. I'm putting you on the spot. Because we're a signatory to the Rome Convention, right? Exactly, right? So sound recordings, Australian sound recordings, when they get played in the UK, the rights holders, the record labels get paid. Great, fantastic. We just said that the performers don't get paid, so that doesn't make sense, does it? So there are different rulings for performers to rights holders. And one of the reasons for that is that there's, in copyright law, there is a sound recording is a piece of property, and a performance and a performer, and this will come back to performer's copyright, a performance and a performer has similar rights in a sound recording, okay? And the UK recognise that, and Australia recognises that they have similar rights in a sound recording, meaning they have part ownership of a sound recording when they have contributed or performed on it, okay? Great, excellent. But it's a different type of right in the sense that they don't have the same bundle of rights that belong to someone who owns a piece of IP, which is a sound recording. So it means that because there are limited rights for a performer, they are only entitled, they're not entitled to be able to put their hand up and say, and we're talking about the UK, by the way, they can't turn around and say, well, I don't want you playing my sound recording on the radio because I own a piece of it. I don't want you playing it on the radio. They don't have those rights. But they do have the right to a remuneration, which is called an equitable remuneration, which is just fair pay. So this type of ownership of a sound recording exists in Australia, and it exists in the concept known as performer's copyright in Australia. So everybody will understand this, that when you go and record as a performer, you either get paid or you have to sign a performer release form. And the reason you're doing that, or you've signed a record deal, the reason you're doing that is you're assigning or you're giving up your rights to part ownership of that sound recording. Yeah? And so you've given that up and you're compensated essentially by being paid. What doesn't happen in Australia is the equitable remuneration, the fair pay for having given up that right. That is neighbouring rights. So that exists in the UK. So in other words, what happens in the UK is Australian sound recordings are being paid, but Australian performers are not being paid simply because we do not reciprocate the right. That's a very roundabout way of trying to explain it, isn't it?
We just came back to exactly what I think we started at. And but I think that base concept, that one, and then to go around and understand a bit about why and the sort of in-depth, difference between the copyrights that you can exploit yourself or have exploited for you or license away or not. Very much comes down in the neighbouring rights space between the UK and Australia is we're not paying you because you don't pay us. So that's a kind of thing that I guess it's a demonstration of how in the weeds this stuff can get and how it's not just a, one size fits all. Hey, I registered with that guy. I'm covered. It's like you're not covered. And there's a whole other conversation also around, when if that rights holder is being paid this money that the performer is not being paid, can the performer get that money from the record label? And then we're into sort of agreements and being aware of where these rights, can and can't be collected for yourself. And just having that as a part of your, I guess, arsenal of things you need to be looked after when you sign that record deal. So yeah, it's like just being aware of those differences. And, Susan's got a lot of stuff here about, the changes that are happening as well. Like there's Brexit has happened. There's, these things that we were saying, 1960, whatever it was, Rome Convention, 2013, the UK changed its mind about something. 2023, it's still changing, still going on.
And I think I do want to drill down on what it was I was just trying to say. So I feel like I've said it in a bit of a confusing way. But so interestingly, as we said, that Australian rights holders receive money when their sound recording is played in the UK. And one of the reasons is not just because we are a Rome Convention country, but the UK actually pays on another concept known as first publication. And again, lawyers in the room will understand that where it's first published, if it happens to be in a Rome Convention country, within the first 30 days, if it's released in a Rome Convention country, within the first 30 days, the sound recording would qualify. Now, if you think about streaming, like it's impossible for it not to be played in a Rome Convention country within the first 30 days, right? So that's the other reason that it would qualify. But the reason I mentioned that, and we're talking about sound recordings here, not the performer's share, the sound recording, the label share. What's interesting about that is US sound recordings. So I just told you that US sound recordings, there's no protection for US sound recordings. But when a US sound recording gets played in the UK, the US rights holders get paid because it's released, again, based on first publication. So in other words, a commissioning territory or a record label in the US has put the record out and it gets played in a Rome Convention country within the first 30 days, one of those being the UK, it would qualify. So the UK, PPL, are having to pay those US rights holders. But I did tell you that they are not a signatory to the Rome Convention. So when a UK sound recording gets played in the US or an Australian sound recording gets played in the US, there's no money because the radio stations don't pay it. Are you all buzzing now? Yeah. So that's on the rights holder side. So I did want to drill down on that, why I mentioned when I talked about that summary of here before about Rome Convention country, first publication, or this concept of material reciprocity versus national treatment. So we'll talk about reciprocity and national treatment a bit more in a minute. But on that whole US side of things, which is fascinating, the owners of the sound recording, the rights holders, are getting paid for UK airplay. But of course, the UK, there's a bit of a problem because the UK are having to pay for using these US sound recordings, and they're not getting any money in return. So one of the problems that they're finding is that there's less money for the people in the UK because they have quite a broad idea of how they pay rights. So it's become quite an issue, a hot issue, and we will talk about that with this whole RAP 2020 case.
Yeah, that's what I was going to.
Yeah, as well.
Pick your brains about.
Yeah, which is pretty interesting. But in terms of then performers, so we just said a US sound recording, if it is being played in a Rome Convention country within the first 30 days of release, based on first publication, the rights holder gets paid. But the US performers do not get paid from the UK. Why? Because, again, neighbouring rights doesn't exist in the US. There's no material reciprocity, so that means that the US doesn't pay UK performers. So every time Ed Sheeran's getting played in the US, he is not receiving money outside of Sound Exchange, which again is digital royalties. It's not from terrestrial radio. So someone like Ed Sheeran, someone like Adele, and even someone like Vance Joy, even someone like any of our Australian artists, when their music is being played in America, they are not receiving money as performers outside of Sound Exchange. Yep. I think it stemmed from the historical payola situation where radio stations always were paid to play the record company's music, and the fact that they're turning around and saying, well, now you the record companies are saying, well, you should be paying us, not the other way around. They're like, that's crazy. We're promoting your music. It's an argument that, is discussed here too. Yep. Did you? Yep.
Sorry, if his company was incorporated in the United States, or is it more to do with citizenship?
So again, still commissioning. So what you're referring to is commissioning territory. Again, because there's no sound recording protection in the US, wouldn't make any difference.
Yeah, it's sort of like it just doesn't exist. Like you could record it anywhere, you could record on the moon. That doesn't exist. Sound exchange, different. Yeah, so like if you're like, in the US, I think Sirius, like digital satellite radio is in every car. We don't really have that so much here. It's kind of a weird thing, but yeah. So if people are playing Ed Sheeran through their digital radios via satellite, Sound Exchange has got him covered. But terrestrial radio, nobody's getting it.
So to clarify, if no American artist would be getting paid in America for this,
terrestrial radio stations don't pay the money to give to them.
Okay,
Yeah. And if we want to bring Australia into it, because hey, this is where we are in Australia, and this is why it's really interesting to understand what's happening internationally, because Ed Sheeran I don't know why we said it. Ed Sheeran.
Go with it. He's great.
I can go with it.
Go with it.
I can go with it. Maybe because of the significance of airplay, because every time I turn on a radio, it's Ed Sheeran's on. So Ed Sheeran getting airplay in Australia, again, the recording qualifies because it's a Rome Convention country, which is the UK. So PPCA pay, obviously. And then Ed Sheeran himself as a performer doesn't get paid out of Australia because Australia only pays Australians. So that's why the UK hate us, and rightly so.
And that's what happened in 2013. Like it was all great, Australian performers being paid by PPL, and then somebody stopped and said, hang on a second, the Australian guys aren't paying our performers. No, we're not having that. The money's still there. It's still, go to the rights owner, but there's just no way for that performer to directly be paid that. And do you know, is there a history between why PPCA took that stance? It's like, did they do we'll sign the Rome Convention, but...
Oh, well, now you're really getting into...
Not to demonise anyone, or we're not going to... Don't...
No, shut up. Hold that thought, because what I haven't talked about is US sound recordings in Australia. So we talked about US sound recordings in the UK, and we've all understood that US sound recordings get covered and paid because of the first publication. So it is common, I think, that people say that US sound recordings are not paid in Australia. So every time you hear a US sound recording, every time Beyonce's played on radio in Australia, radio does not have to pay for the use of that sound recording. Why do you think there's so much US, sound recordings on radio? But the lovely Lynn Small pulled me up on that point. She's a master. She's full of knowledge a few years ago, and I agree with her that it's not as simplistic as that. And so I did my homework, and I usually try to think about it from the background of what I understand about things internationally, because my learning has come from the international background, and then I kind of put Australia against it and go, well, there's a problem there. So what happens, how does Australia determine whether a sound recording qualifies? And so I didn't want to get it wrong. One of the things here is commissioning territory. So it could be who made the recording. So if we're talking about a Beyonce recording, if it was a US recording company that owns the sound recordings, again, it's not protected. So that wouldn't be protected in Australia. It could be country of recording, so where the track was recorded. So if Beyonce recorded her US sound recording in the US, again, that wouldn't qualify because not part of the Rome Convention. We have a crack. Well, before I get to it, we also have this point that says qualifying performers, which I think is completely bizarre because Australia doesn't pay its performers. essentially. They don't pay them. It says qualifying performers, the names of everybody who performed on the recordings and the citizenship or residency at the date the recording was made. So what they're saying there is if there happens to be an Aussie on a Beyonce sound recording, it may mean that that sound recording, that US sound recording could qualify. So that's interesting. But where they have a crack of this first publication thing, it doesn't make sense to me. It says Australia's attempt, so it says overseas recordings may attract a period of interim protection following release and may be protected from the date of first commercial release until the earlier of 7 weeks after the release. Does that make any sense to you?
No.
Nope. Me neither. So I feel like that was their crack at first publication, but it doesn't cover it. So essentially, on the whole, US sound recordings do not qualify in Australia, and then US performers don't qualify. In fact, no performers outside of Australian featured performers qualify for Australian remuneration. But back to your point.
That's a bit funny,
yes.
isn't it?
What was your point that you made before?
My point earlier was, why did Australia say, we're going to sign this Rome Convention, but we're not going to do this bit?
Okay, yes. So yes, our sound recordings are protected, but that's where, I mentioned the WPPT, which is really exciting. That's the other piece of legislation, which was WIPO, performers, phonogram performers treaty. So that essentially we are also a signatory of, and any country that is a signatory of that generally has reciprocity between all the other countries that are a signatory of the WPPT, which is most of Europe and the UK and everything. But there was a little section that we decided not to tick, which was called 15.1, which makes me very upset.
I know, it's crazy.
I think it's because they just didn't understand, and that's why we need to be talking about this. But it's called 15.1 of the WPPT for anybody who wants to look it up, and it talks about whether performers should be compensated for every time they're played on radio. And Australia said, no, stuff the performers. So what happened is there was so there wasn't any outrage about it. There was an ex gratia payment made to performers in Australia. So that means we don't have neighbouring rights. You only have a year to collect it. There's so many other, they don't pay non-feature performers. Just to give you a crazy example, because people love this kind of stuff, we represent Crowded House. Crowded House on their latest record, that PPCA won't pay them because they now reside in New Zealand. So that's kind of some crazy stuff for you.
Yeah, it's wild. Just the fact that it can be so different in so many places, and we signed the Rome Convention, but it's just not. And because when that 2013 thing happened, it was very, like, in my sort of role, we were seeing artists coming through. It's like, oh hey, how's that PPL check looking? And it's like, why is that so little? What's happening here? And that was the rollout of that. All of a sudden, the tap was turned off because of Australia's little shonky business down here. Don't tick the box. And that was a lot of lost revenue for Australian performers. Yeah, man.
Hey. Oh, shit. Sorry.
Hi.
Quick question on this. I arrived late. Apologies. So I may have missed something about this, but is it possible to, when you do say like a remaster of any song that was released in the States or anywhere else outside of Australia initially, but through an Australian record label, through some kind of licensing deal, would that then qualify for sound recording royalties for the label at very least, rather than the performers?
Remastering?
Yeah, so a new ISRC, new kind of sound recording in itself.
Well, see, that's the thing, I guess, if you re-recorded it, perhaps, but I'm just...
Unquote,
yeah. Well, I mean, that's gets in the weeds a bit there, doesn't it? Like, if it was only if you just put those original tapes onto the machine and tweaked a few buttons, I don't know. It doesn't sound like the performance is different,
Yeah, I'm just trying to get across what your question is actually asking. You're talking about the rights holder share and a licensing deal internationally?
Well, basically, seeing the opportunity from an international business's standpoint, if they see that there is money on the table for sound recording royalties, in Australia, but they can't get access to them. Technically, could they do any deal with an Australian company to re-release the music, re-record it, say, and then once that's released in Australia, rights holders within Australia collect that, and then of course what they do with it after that is
that's
up to them.
two, and I guess that would get really confusing with the metadata, but that's two separate recordings. If one
Yeah.
recording is, again, we're talking about commissioning territory, where the record label is based. So if Sony US do a recording and then they go, oh, we won't get our money for Beyonce, let's record it again in Australia, I don't think they're going to do that. But yeah, hey.
Yeah, and if the question was like, if we just remaster it, as opposed to make a new recording, I don't think that's going to fly, because it's the same performance. You know what I mean? The dudes in the studio to tape, it's the same
How
thing.
much of the track has to be re-recorded for it to qualify as a re-recording?
Well, it just has to be a separate ISRC, and but yeah, the commissioning territory would be either Sony US or Sony Australia, and
And then that recording might be subject, because now it's an Australian kind of thing, so you're going to get screwed by the UK because, you know what I mean?
Totally.
I mean, I guess rights owner side is a little less complicated than the neighbouring right.
Sure, for sure.
Yeah, fun and games.
Yeah, fun and games.
Yeah.
Did we want to talk about RAP now?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, it's good. So coming back to the idea that this stuff is just not staying still.
Yeah,
Things are moving.
Because where are we now? Yeah, because time's getting on. So RAP. RAP is a little collection society in Ireland. Obviously, seems that maybe they don't have a lot of significance, but they have a lot of significance in what happened in 2020. So RAP is a collection society that is set up to collect on behalf of performers, so the performer share. So we're still obviously just talking about the sound recording. So RAP collect on behalf of performers. PPI is the rights holder collection body equivalent to the PPCA in Australia. In Ireland. So PPI, what happened is RAP took PPI to court because they said, hey, what's going on? Surely there was a dispute between the two parties based on the interpretation of what should be paid, that equitable remuneration collected by PPI, again, PPCA is equivalent, from the users of sound recordings, should be shared between both record companies and performers. And so there was a bit of a dispute about it, and they took it to the European Court of Justice, and this was in 2020. And this is known as the RAP case, RAAP, if anybody wants to look it up, because I know this is really making you feel excited, right? And you're going to go and look it up after this. So the RAP case, which is where they were trying to understand what were some of the problems, why some rights holder bodies like PPCA or PPI in Ireland or PPL in the UK decided not to pay performers. And so one of the things was to do with reciprocity. So the reason the UK, again, doesn't pay us is because it's not reciprocated. Not because we're not a signatory to the Rome Convention or because we didn't tick the WPPT. It's not reciprocated. So the reason also why the UK doesn't pay US performers is because essentially it's not reciprocated. If it was reciprocated, they might pay them even if they're not a signatory to the Rome Convention, because as we just heard, their sound recordings qualify based on first publication. So here, the European Court of Justice was basically stating, I wrote it down here, this is what they said. Performers involved should have a right to an equitable remuneration for that right. So they said they believe that they should be entitled to the equivalent amount of money that record companies receive, that performers should receive the other 50%. So that's kind of a broad way of thinking. Whereas a lot of these other societies, like the UK, have been paying on what's called reciprocity. So again, if a society's not paying, a country's not paying them, they're not going to pay it. Some other countries like Germany will pay on performers on first publication. So there's this kind of really odd, complex web of why some countries will pay and why some countries won't. And just in a nutshell, most countries pay Australian performers because we are a signatory of the Rome Convention, but there's a bit of a niggling feeling because we don't reciprocate the rights. So it could be taken away from us at any point.
As has happened in 2013.
As has happened in the UK. So the European Court of Justice with this RAP case are seeking to find a resolve. And this is where Brexit comes in because the UK is a signatory to this EU directive, which talks about making sure performers are remunerated. And since Brexit came in, they've been looking at the fact that the UK is not acting in accordance with the legislation that it had signed up to, and they seek to make amendments to ensure that they are operating under what is required of them within those different pieces of international legislation.
You can't get away that easy,
yeah,
UK.
Yeah, so the European Court of Justice have called them out on it, and so the Intellectual Property Office in the UK, and there's a big bill that's going through in the UK at the moment in relation to all these things, where they're saying that they don't feel this reciprocity idea is correct.
Not enough.
No.
Yeah.
And what the US is calling for and has actually been able to, they've taken a lot of these societies to court in the same way that RAP, the Little Irish Society, took their rights holder organisation to court. The US has taken a lot of these rights holder collection societies to court. And what they've done is they've based it on this concept called national treatment. Are you going to ask me what national treatment is?
What's national treatment,
Do you know what national treatment is? It's just as it sounds. It's a principle that says countries should treat imported goods, services, and IP in the same way they treat their own. Yeah, so fairly obvious. So they are utilising national treatment to ensure that their US performers get paid. Now, that's very interesting when you talk about Australia, because my question is, why are we not going in there and saying,
right.
Hello, where's our money?
Exactly.
National treatment. That's one point. So these are the kinds of discussions that are so imperative to our Australian music industry and will bring in a lot of extra money for our Australian music industry.
Absolutely, because Susan dropped the B word, billions. Like, it's not a lie. It's a lot of money. Yeah, certainly.
Obviously, if you've got a top 10 track, so we've represented some major artists. So we've got some good. We've got some figures that we're black and white figures. This is not like fudging it or anything. We've got black and white figures. Some of the artists that we represented over time, international artists, have been people like Rihanna and Beyonce and like crazy. And Rihanna qualified because she was from Barbados. Beyonce didn't. Beyonce got like 10K, like hardly anything because she's a US performer, and the only way US performers get money, again, was based on little bits and pieces of digital radio from the UK. Whereas Rihanna, because Barbados was a qualifying territory, we're talking six figures. But, that's for like a top 10 track in the UK. And that's one track over a year. So, yeah. Any Australian artist that has had success in the UK, that's what they're losing. That's what they've lost.
Yep. Yeah. It's crazy. And so, where do you think the Australia, what do you think should be done? There's people talking about the sort of national treatment and let's get all this, let's get on the same level here. What could happen for Australia? What do you think is a good outcome here for us?
Well, there's a few things. So one of the things that's obviously very topical. We talked about the last month with the Senate inquiry was the PPCA cap. And talking into that, again, it's about increasing license fees, which need to happen, obviously. But my stance on that was always about if we're talking about radio and we're talking about record companies, the performers right smack bang in the middle of that. And there are solutions that can help both radio and record companies to ensure everybody's, remunerated, including performers. So there are some things that we were hoping to be able to discuss. Australia signing or ticking 15.1 of the WPPT, which is part of an advocacy group that I have called Genuine Article, which is about pushing to get Australia to tick that 15.1 box, which a lot of the industry is not aware of. Certainly the government's not aware of, so they need to be made aware of. So that's one thing. The other thing, again, as we've talked about, is national treatment, that we could utilise that to push that through. But we may not even have to do that because certainly within the UK and certainly throughout the rest of Europe, a lot of Europe have adopted this national treatment concept. So we've seen a lot of societies like the Netherlands, which changed their rulings in 2022 and they pay US performers now. Germany is always paid on first publication, so performers. So a session muso here in Australia that never receives any money, they can get money from Germany.
That's it. It's crazy.
It's so weird.
And it's happening last
so wrong.
year. Things are changing.
Yeah.
This year, things are changing.
But that's the kind of stuff that makes me mad about this, that we don't, we don't recognise these things. So a lot of Europe are actually starting to pay US performers. So I don't think at any time soon they're going to stop paying Australian performers, if US performers are now being paid from a lot of countries based on national treatment. But also the UK, part of what they're doing with the Brexit thing, and as I said, having to make sure that they are aligned with the pieces of legislation they'd signed previously, European legislation. They were talking about this. This is this mouthful that I was speaking to you in the green room, and it's called the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as the CPTPP. Wow, that's a mouthful. Just let me give you a heads up as to why this is important. So legislation currently before UK Parliament will introduce a new route to qualification for all rights in recorded performances, linking qualification to the countries of authorship and publication of the relevant sound recording. Related secondary legislation would make CPTPP countries, such as Australia, fully qualifying countries for performers' equitable remuneration. Wow, doesn't that sound cool?
I liked it.
I know. Basically, what they're saying is because of this different secondary piece of legislation, we may actually qualify anyway as Australians to do with trade agreements, essentially trans-Pacific partnerships and so forth. So we may qualify not based on trying to get the government to understand what 15.1 is, not based on national treatment, but we might just qualify based on this. And if that doesn't happen, then all these other options that the UK are considering in order to bring themselves in line with the rest of the world could possibly mean that
they'll pay us again.
Yeah, that performers essentially will be treated in the same way as rights holders, and that is all we're pushing for. That's what equitable remuneration or neighbouring rights is, that they're treated in the same way as rights holders.
Yeah, doesn't sound like much to ask, but obviously it's very confusing and very lots of layers to get through, and legislation and different countries' ideas of what should and shouldn't be.
Yeah.
But pay us.
Yeah, and again, the European Court of Justice, this is where this right, the French actually brought this right in. Gotta love the French. Brought this right in. The ECJ, so the European Court of Justice, reaffirmed equal treatment as a fundamental principle of how nations engage with one another.
Hear, hear. Totally. So yeah, it's. I think that's a great note to kind of wrap up on. It's it doesn't take that much to be kind of fair, does it? You know what I mean? but very complicated space. And it's it is. I do find it interesting just because it's kind of so new and still evolving. As Susan mentioned, you're going back to the 1800s when you're talking about sheet music and composers and and the money trail through that top half of the thing, or the right half, with APRA and the societies over there, it's kind of, it's relatively smooth sailing. Everyone's painting each other, everyone's got their deals, everyone understands it. But, the last hour kind of explaining how different that is for a performer in the sort of sound recording zone. And, and I guess that kind of, it could be a whole other thing because I think we've sort of got to wrap it up. But when you talk about performers, there's also, what about producers? What about the session players? The sound recording, a songwriter wrote the song, or maybe many people wrote the song. When it comes to a recording, there's kind of, there can be quite a few people involved. And these rights and this equitable remuneration can sometimes filter down to a producer or a session player through a different avenue. So, yeah, it's a wild, woolly world.
Yeah, and whilst we might be talking about, I love that we get the opportunity here. Thank you so much, Neil, for this opportunity to be able to talk at this level about what's happening across the world. Because we're on the bottom half of the planet, it saddens me that Australians don't get informed. We need to be. We are a part of the world, and we have a wonderful music industry, and we should be at the same level, or the same level of understanding. And it's not against Australia. The US is also way behind. When I go to the States, people have no idea what I'm talking about. But again, they're not a signatory to the Rome Convention, so
neither is
that's
North
fair
Korea.
enough.
North Korea,
but South Korea is.
Yeah, totally. But US and North Korea, pretty much.
And China, China has rights in sound recordings, but not performers. So Asia is starting to bring on, remuneration to performers. But I think that brings us around to, we've talked about up here, but we understand that in Australia, what does that look like? And don't forget, we've represented many performers who suddenly, they've recorded something in their bedroom, it's gone off on TikTok, and suddenly it's around the world, and it's massive. And usually what happens there is there's collaborators on a sound recording, so that, someone sampled an old recording, and there's a few different recordings in the one recording. So that's all fun and games. It's great to get into that. And of course, we have the common conversation about LODs and sound exchange and producers. So we're happy to talk about that. But one of those problems that people have when it comes to LODs is situations where a producer in America, and again, the lawyers in America who don't understand neighbouring rights, they're like, oh, here's the producer agreement, and you have to pay us this much money from all these different territories, as part of that remuneration to the producer. Because just so you know, often producers are not seen as having an audible contribution. They're often seen in this old role of being someone up the back that's calling time on how much the session's costing. But as we know, most producers actually contribute to sound recordings. So they're known as performing producers in most parts of the world. Australia doesn't pay them, but so they'll do this LOD believing that they're not entitled to any money outside of this letter of direction. So you're then paying them because, you feel right, or they should be remunerated. But then, as I always say, that producer can go directly to Germany, they can go directly to the UK, they can go directly to South Korea, they can go directly to Spain, they can go directly to Italy. All over the world, most parts of the world, they can go and get their money directly. So you're paying them, and then they're getting their money directly as well. So it's something you need to think about.
Yeah, it's just a matter of understanding that, people are doing the right thing. They're doing the thing that they should be doing by the agreement, and yep, we've got that money, we'll do our producer points over here, but no, they can register themselves, and maybe they have, or maybe they haven't. It's just...
And they probably don't even realise themselves that they have.
A lot of the time. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So that's kind of, one of the things to watch out on, I think, with LODs, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. It's a quite a US-centric thing because, as you say, Australia doesn't pay producers as a performer. It's just the featured sort of band for want of a better word. But
And
yeah,
also, like a US producer, even
Yeah.
if they were a featured performer, they wouldn't get paid her anyway because they're a
No.
US citizen.
yeah.
So you're paying them something that they wouldn't even qualify for.
Yeah, wild. So I guess, I don't know, do we go for questions?
Yeah, are
question
there any
time?
comments or questions?
Just on that note, when you were talking about a contributor going to other countries directly and asking for what they're rightfully owed, would they be going directly to the collection societies for that?
Yes, each collection management organisation.
Okay, awesome. And I just have another little question, is if you were to summarize what the definition of neighbouring rights is in like 1 or 2 sentences, like what is that? Thank you.
It's the okay, 1 or 2 sentences.
You can do 3.
Try hard.
I can do 3.
Try hard.
It's a performer's contribution to a sound recording, and that sound recording's airplay, the public performance of the sound recording. So it's a performer's contribution to it. Yeah. So get your brain into sound recording world. Left side of the brain, right side of the brain. One side is music publishing, the other side is sound recording, the sound recording. And of that sound recording, that's split into 2 halves, as we said, 50% performer share, 50% label share.
Thank you.
Go ahead, we've got a mic. Yeah, go.
Just following on from this question here, if a producer or the producer's manager goes to these other territories and attempts to register the producer in Germany or whatever other countries, how easy or difficult is that? And would you suggest that perhaps if you're in that situation, you might appoint a collection agency at that point?
It's really hard to work on behalf of producers because they often have an enormous catalogue. And it's a huge amount of work. Being able to prove their contribution on a track, unless they've got all their ducks in a row and they've been able to have the evidence, it's a huge amount of work. And the producer then earns probably about a maximum of 7%, usually 3.5% per territory, whereas a feature performer is more like 65%. So there's a lot of extra work for very little money. So which is why a lot of companies don't, or agents don't look after producers. But certainly there can be consultation, which is probably, that's what we do, is we consult generally to producers to let them know the best territories to go to, how to go about it.
I have more questions, but let someone else have a go.
Hello again. Could you tell me, and again, sorry if I missed this, where a lot of these qualifying territories actually generate these royalties from? As in, is it purely from terrestrial radio, digital streaming, or is it also included in film and downloads of video games and things like that?
Nightclubs, like public performance in a space. Similar to, again, I think the reason that royalty nerds like us fall back to a system like this is to sort of show that what happens on one side often happens on the other side when it comes to the musical work copyright and the sound recording copyright. So you walk into a milk bar or a hairdresser and you see the APRA sticker, you'll probably see it's not PPCA now, is it? It's the One Mob.
One Music.
That hairdresser is going to pay APRA and they're going to pay...
You're not going to mention AMCOS, are you?
No, I told you. Radio is obviously a massive one. When it comes
it's
to
not.
that,
It's not film. It's more sync. But it's exactly.
Just public performance.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that radio is probably the biggest thing that performs publicly.
But there's also like Asia does a lot of like karaoke. That's massive, like huge. So we've been finding out. And private copying as well as a result of that. So there's really big monies in Asia from karaoke and private copying as well. So Japan pays solely on private copying, which is interesting.
So pretty much it's generated on the other side of the coin as performance royalties. Is that exclusively it?
Performance
Sorry,
royalties.
as in performance, as in like if you are performing the work.
Public performance, you mean
Yes,
as in
yeah.
broadcast? And
Yeah.
Yes, that's what it's from, correct.
Okay. In the case of video games being played on Twitch and things like that, is that also then a thing, or is no?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no money coming in from YouTube. Streaming's still it's in its infancy. I'm sure the record companies don't want that to happen. But I think that's probably, it's not a discussion I'm willing to have, but I think that's on the table.
And also because I think a lot of services like Spotify, for example, it's a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a private use thing. Like, technically, cafes shouldn't be using Spotify to play over the thing because the end user agreement you enter into with Spotify when you check that box and don't read the shit, that says that this is for your personal use. So that's why they're not going to pay a public performance fee because, well, you shouldn't be playing our shit publicly. So,
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
yeah.
I just had a question about like reciprocity and first play. So I guess a lot of us, Australian artists don't get paid in the UK despite being a signatory to the UK convention because of that idea of reciprocity. However, US artists who are played in the UK do get paid because of that principle of first play. Is that
They
correct?
don't get paid from the UK but they get paid from other territories that are now paying based on national treatment.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So then,
They get small amounts from the UK for those types of alternative kind of sundry digital, because again, if we're basing it on reciprocity and the US pay on digital radio, I don't think digital radio is anywhere, well, it's still big in the UK.
Yeah,
But
I haven't
we
found
don't see much coming through for US artists. But,
No.
from the UK.
Yeah, totally. And it's in terms of digital radio itself, US seems
US
that's
pay
what they do.
$20 a spin for the performer from digital radio. It's massive. Sorry, your question? Yep.
yeah, sorry. So I guess my question really is like, if a lot of countries can get out of, I suppose, like, paying artists because there isn't that idea of reciprocity, then I guess what really is that, like, advantage of being a signatory to the Rome Convention?
Well, the record companies get paid.
Okay.
Did I say that too quickly? That's the advantage.
Yeah, and because the Rome Convention at that level is participating in the rights owner being paid. And then the sort of next level down, the box that Australia didn't tick is for the performer. So to entrench within that 50% to go to the performer. That's, I guess, the
And again, it's
different
that
layer.
concept, understanding that, when we're identifying what a work is, we'll say a composition is a work, a sound recording is a work, a party to a work. And, they have exclusive rights, whereas performers don't have exclusive rights because it's not an actual work or it's not that spark of an idea. So they have to jump through more hoops to qualify. So that's what the European Court of Justice is trying to rule out, that they should be treated in the same way.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is great. We're actually being able to kind of explain further all that stuff we just said.
Hi, excuse me. Hi again. Okay, this is, I don't quite know how to ask this question, but as a casual observer, it appears that copyright is constantly being challenged by technology development after technology, and now we've got AI to throw into the mix. This is outside your remit, but what are the industries doing to look at alternative business models than what seems to be Band-Aid over Band-Aid over Band-Aid, just to the casual observer?
You want to talk about AI?
Oh, no. I mean, it's just such a fresh, wild thing. I mean, I'm still kind of back on the idea. So we'll talk about, again, the basic thing, public performance of a sound recording. That's kind of what we're talking about here. And on the other side of that, with the APRA world, you have live performance. So if there's musicians amongst you, I'm sure everybody knows you register with APRA, you write a song, you register that, you play down at the pub, you put your form in, and you get paid as a songwriter for performing your stuff live. And then so logic says that, well, you don't get that for live performance from PPCA, because how do you live perform a recording? Like that's, but it's like, but hang on, we can though. Like I've got a computer with a recording that I can perform live in a room. Like, should that be doing something? So I'm not past that concept. AI, no idea.
Yeah, I did.
I'm just not sure how anyone, like, who's the creator, who owns it. I mean, maybe it is easier in the recording world, because if it's owned by someone, then who cares where it came from? We own it.
I heard. I did hear a talk. I think at South by Southwest, where they're talking about watermarking AIs, so they could obviously identify what is a human being and what isn't. And of course, that would make it a lot easier in the world of neighbouring rights. Yeah.
But yeah.
Because you need the spark, because something to be exactly. Yeah, because I think that the idea, the right to copy something, there needs to be, and the lawyers here will tell us that there needs to be a spark in order to to bring copyright into into being.
There's actually a really good episode on what's that podcast? I know you listen to it.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about it. There's a podcast, and they actually talk about
Something
AI,
money.
and they say that it's at the moment the conversation is about who actually instructs, so who presses the key, like on the keyboard to say, create that song. Who briefs? Yeah, exactly. Whoever does that, they are actually still the owner as the performer.
And
Just
that's their spark.
I think just the point of my question kind of got murky amongst AI there, but is the industry looking at alternative business models apart from all that map behind you? Is there a different business model which is more suitable to developing technologies than something which was created, 150 years ago, and then band-aided ever since? So does that make sense?
I think there will be. I mean, and if you look at how all the legislation has come into being, obviously with the Berne Convention in the 1880s, as they were able to manufacture print music, going to obviously the Rome Convention, you can see it moving along the timeline, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, so you can see it moving. But legislation is so much slower than technology. So that's why everybody's kind of like going, oh, I don't know.
And there's so many vested interests as well, as humans and greedy people, and like there's a lot people want to find somewhere to take advantage of and roll that. Like, if we could burn that down and find the perfect thing to do, like, would be a great race of humans. But it's a tricky one. It would be great to rethink it, and maybe there's blockchain solutions to these things. And I know distributors have gone down digital distributors have gone down the road of automating splits and having things just fly out here and there, and you just you automatically get your stuff whenever you should get your stuff, and it's played anywhere in the world. Like that sounds fantastic, but I haven't seen it fully work yet.
And I think if you look at what's going on with neighbouring rights, obviously with songwriting and APRA and so forth, it seems, a pretty straightforward process of how, everybody talks to each other and everyone gets on, happy families. And of course, they're ironing out some of these issues in relation to, obviously, rights holders have always received this money, but when neighbouring rights came into play as a result of the EU directive in 1997, they recognised that a contributor, there's more to a sound recording than zeros and ones or, sound waves, that, there were performers that had contributed to it. And, I often say when people kind of wonder whether a performer has helped a sound recording, have sales or get airplay, I mean, you look at someone like Whitney Houston's performance of Dolly Parton's "I Will Always Love You," and there's so many great artists out there that bring a song to life and enable the sound recording to get far more airplay. I mean, how can you diminish a performer's role on a sound recording? And again, this is the part that always gets me worked up, is because musicians spend their whole lives becoming great musicians, like many, many years working on their art. And the fact that they don't get remunerated every time that sound recording is being played, the fact that you can have a John Farnham record that is still getting loads of airplay from the 1980s, and all of those session musicians, that amazing musicians on those sound recordings, have never received a penny out of Australia for every time they hear You're the Voice. I'm not sure you'd be happy at shopping at Coles and hearing You're the Voice constantly on it and hearing your part and knowing you've never got paid for it, other than your $200. So there's a lot of food for thought. Musicians bring a lot to a sound recording and a lot of value, and they should be remunerated.
That'd be a good one.
No pressure. Just something that you were saying before, Susan, I was just gobsmacked by, so I just wanted to get you to confirm it. You mentioned over in the US earning $20 per radio spin, was it? Was this the songwriter or the performer or both?
This is the performer.
Okay, so if that's the case for the performer, how much would the songwriter be earning?
I know nothing about songwriters.
Okay.
I am a sound recording person.
Yep.
I know some about publishing, to be fair. I was a songwriter, but no, I would never comment on something like that, no.
Wow, that's just such a huge amount. I wonder why they pay so well.
That's just digital radio, yeah. I guess, good question.
Yeah, mentioned earlier, digital satellite radio just kind of isn't a thing here, but it's such a huge thing there.
Yeah, they were obviously able to negotiate great license fees. And I've spoken to someone who was instrumental, who I know quite well, a lawyer in the US, in setting that up, and they are questioning it, thinking, oh, that's a lot. But anybody who has dealt with Sound Exchange and has seen the monies that are coming through Sound Exchange, you would probably agree with me that sounds about right. So yeah, it's fascinating, especially when you compare it to what we're paying here in Australia. So.
Thanks.
All right. I think we'll finish it there. Thank you very much to
Thanks, Neil.
these two for that.
Thanks, everyone.
That was very
Thanks
good.
for coming and putting up with us.